Well, hello and welcome back to Roundtable Mindset. This is Jamie.
And I'm Malin.
And we're back for an all new, I don't know what kind of episode this is going to be. I don't know if it's exciting, but it's going to be a fun conversation.
I think it's going to be, I hope it's enlightening and tough at the same time. Because again, as we're wrapping up, well, I would say on the tail end at least of our difficult conversations, this one hits home for me. Very personal. And I think it's going to be tough, but it's going to be good, I think. Maybe not excited, but
it's not
good.
Exciting, but I'm excited for the conversation. How's that? To use exciting as many times as we can in this introduction.
Yeah, we've used it, and we're not going to use it while we're using it. So
no, I'm owning it. It's fine.
I think that's a new low for us, Jamie. I think it's been a long time coming. We've been batting around this idea for a while, kind of finding the right time to maybe pull the trigger and talk about this. So today, if you haven't noticed by the title, we are going to be talking about narcissists and narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. Before we get going, though, I think it's really important. And I think Jamie's smiling at me because she knows I'm about to give a disclaimer, which I normally don't do.
Right. I'm so proud of you.
We are not clinical psychologists, and we cannot diagnose. We can't tell that somebody has a certain personality disorder just because of their actions. Most of this is just a conversation based off of personal experience. There might be some conclusions that I come to that I might say, hey, this person I'm talking about, I believe is a narcissist. Doesn't mean that I can diagnose them in any way, shape, or form. So I just want to kind of put that out there before we get going. Anything else you'd like to add there, Jamie?
I do, actually. Just thinking about when dealing with difficult situations in relationships and people, there might be some triggering conversation today about experiences and stuff like that too. And so if that's something that is difficult for you, please take a minute, pause, take care of yourselves, come back and listen when you're ready. But, just know that might be part of this conversation. I have no idea for sure because we are bringing on some guests and so it's not my experiences to share. But just in case, I just want you to be aware that might be part of this conversation too.
Yes. And as we kind of speed through our introduction, because I think there's a lot of content here, you touched on some of the guests that we're bringing on. And I will say that we have two individuals that are coming on. They have a podcast that they do that's called Becoming Human AF that I have put on my short list. We'll continue to listen to and kind of get to know. We are getting to know these two podcasters as well. They seem like they're really wonderful people. So we are going to introduce you to Steph and Sam from Becoming Human AF. How are you guys doing today?
Sorry, I always have a hard time unmuting.
Yeah, me too. Hi.
I can never find the button when I need it. But I'm good. I'm doing well. Thank you guys so much for having us today. And thanks for that lovely introduction. So just quickly, I'm from New York City. I'm kind of here as sort of somebody who's been hearing a lot about narcissism on the internet and in the media, and I'm excited to dive into it from sort of an outside looking in perspective.
Well, welcome. We're excited to have you here. And this is, and I guess we should probably say this has been in the works for a while. I feel like, we've kind of been in conversation for a little bit. You and Malin have been talking about, trying to collaborate some way with another podcast that you do because you have a couple. So yeah, I'm excited that you're finally here. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And we actually have one. We actually have one more person. So go ahead, Sam.
So yeah, the other one was Steph, and I'm Sam. I'm hailing from good old Canada up here in the north, and I definitely have experience with narcissism, narcissistic abuse. So I'm very excited, interested, a little nervous about this conversation and where it's going to go, but a deeper conversation definitely needs to be had around narcissism and narcissistic abuse, because it's a lot of social media talks about narcissism, and I think diving into it and really explaining more so of what it is, that conversation needs to be had. So I'm really excited to be here to have that conversation.
Well, and there is a ton of TikTokers that are talking about narcissism in 60-second bites, and TikTokers with degrees talking about narcissism in 60-second bites. But I think it's because these kind of things do touch a ton of people. I mean, it is, I don't know that the diagnosis is super common, but I do think that some of these challenges can feel very familiar to a lot of different people. So I'm kind of excited to dive in today. Thanks for bringing this one, Malin.
Well, it's not, thanks for all of us having this conversation. We might not be thanking each other at the end of it because we'll probably be like, oh, this was such a horrible topic.
We're just going to go cry in the bathtub now.
Exactly. But I do kind of want to start off the conversation. I think you guys organically just kind of went there, which is there's a lot of people talking about narcissism and narcissists, and they're sharing stories. And I'm, Jamie, you mentioned TikTok. I've seen them on Reddit. I've seen Facebook posts about it. You seemed like you can't throw a stone too far into the internet without hitting narcissism at some point. But I do kind of want to talk about that, because I also think, although that exposure is really great and people are talking about it, I almost feel like it's become a buzzword now. People hear that and they just almost kind of roll their eyes, as almost in disbelief, like, because everybody uses it, or maybe they overuse it, or there's some situations that people label as a narcissism when they're not. And so I kind of want to just touch on that for a few minutes, the overuse of the term. I think talking about a subject is one thing, but it feels like we've kind of morphed into an area where now it's almost over talked about, and people just kind of shut down as if it's being overused. And even if you have a legitimate situation where it is dealing with a narcissist, it's almost just kind of thrown out, the baby with the bathwater kind of mentality. Like it just can't be because it's there. So can we touch on that for a little bit? Because I've been experiencing that, and I know I have my own personal stories that I would like to share at some point in time. But even with the individuals that I have shared those with, they almost don't believe them, because everybody's crying narcissistic behaviors now, right? Like everybody has a relationship with a narcissist. At least it seems like that way.
I think that is the key to the conversation, because narcissism is a spectrum. And one of the biggest things for me to wrap my head around it was, everyone has narcissistic traits. Everybody, we gaslight. Like, when you learn those behaviors, you understand, like, oh, this was taught to me in childhood because parents do it to kids all the time. There's a difference, though. A narcissist will continue to do it. So it's a pattern of behavior versus like a one-time or two-time off type of thing. And when you have a conversation with that person, generally they're able to understand, empathize, not blame you, change their actions or whatever. Whereas with a narcissist, actions don't match words is the biggest thing that begins to tell the story of whether or not this is actually a narcissistic person versus you're like a normal person on the lower end of the scale. Like most people are like 1 to 2. But the other thing that Jamie was kind of talking about before of, there's not many people diagnosed. Narcissists aren't usually diagnosed because they don't believe that they have a problem. And so they won't ever seek therapy, and they actually use therapy as a way to glean more information to continue their cycles of abuse. It's really messed up.
Let that sink in there for a second, because the tool that people use to go to help kind of, learn to, I don't know if I want to call it disability. I'm not very good in this space, but the tool that people go to use to help them when they have these type of disorders, for this group of people, they actually use that as a way to continue abusing the people around them. That's messed up. That's
wild.
Narcissism happens in relationships, and it's usually close personal relationships. And so you'll seek therapy as a, means of trying to understand, because a lot of the time it's communication, right? Narcissism happens via communication. And so you go into therapy, and the narcissist uses the details gleaned in therapy to continue the abuse. And most times, if the therapist is not trained in seeing particular patterns, they will actually continue to support the abuse, because the victim actually looks like the unreasonable person.
There are a couple of creators that I have come across that are like, say that they're narcissists in recovery. Their eyes were open to what was happening and what they were experiencing, and that they are working through that, which I thought was really fascinating, because I do think that that is probably one of the more telltale signs, is that it's everybody else, right? And so as long as every single relationship you have, it's the other person's problem, it's really hard, I think, to take an introspective look at yourself and say, hey, I'm doing something to cause this problem. So it is kind of interesting when I come across those particular creators that are like, no, I am a narcissist and I'm working through my crap and this is what I experienced. Those are kind of fascinating, because I don't know that happens a ton either. So yeah, that's
takes really a lot of like guts to acknowledge that publicly and say, like, I was this way and I'm working on it. So kudos to those people.
Yeah.
I will say that, like kind of going back to what Malin was talking about earlier, about how the word is thrown around and people just use it. I mean, we were talking about offline, like my experience with narcissism. I don't really think that I know anybody who is a true 100% a narcissist. I can't even think of anybody in my life that is. And yet, I hear all the time from friends across the board, from people in my life, when they're mad at somebody in their own life, they'll call so and so a narcissist, or they'll say this person's being a narcissist. But then if you push them further and like actually have a conversation about it, they'll be like, oh, like they're not a narcissist. They were just acting narcissistic. So I think that this word is really being watered down and overused and almost thrown out there when we're upset with people, but it's not, we don't actually mean it, because a lot of people don't actually understand that what it entails. A lot of people don't understand like what Sam is describing here. Like that's the reality of narcissism. It's not, okay, your husband being mean to you or your boss is like wanting you to do all of this extra work. It's abuse. And I think that if people understood that, they might not be so quick to use that word.
I agree with you, Steph. And I think I'm going to use my own personal experience here. You know, I have a family member who I believe, again, I can't diagnose, but I believe based off of years of interacting with this individual, they are a narcissist. And I've had people talk to me before, and I've heard conversations too, right? Like people get mad and they're like, oh, I deal with a narcissist. I'm like, well, how do you know? And they just stare at me. And I'm like, well, how do you know they're a narcissist? Or why do you believe they're a narcissist? And so they'll tell me all these things about, oh, they're just mean to me or blah, blah. And the word that I had to kind of go back to myself to say, okay, and again, we talk about a spectrum. So I can't believe this is exactly the same how it fits for everybody, which is probably in and of itself another really hard trait to nail down someone with this disorder, because it may not look exactly the same in every situation. But the one thing that I kind of resonate in my ear is it's a level of control. It's a way to control the individuals in their life in some degree. So it might be with a parent to a child, or it might be with a spouse, you know, a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband. It might be a coworker, you know, whatever it is. It's all centered around this need to have control over the people and things happening in their life. I love hearing you guys say that there's people that are narcissists that are in recovery. I almost feel like if you are a narcissist, once you realize you are having these traits and you're working to fix them, it almost makes you not a narcissist anymore. Because I feel like one of the greatest characteristics of being a narcissist is you are blatantly unaware of just how much you are damaging people and that level of control and what you will go through to keep that control over of other people in your life. I don't know, you know, Sam, if you can relate or not, but that's kind of how I wanted to put this definition around narcissism, because it is all about, in my opinion, that control that they want to have over your life or other people's lives.
Yeah, the control is massive. And I think, you know, I personally, and partially because I'm still working on the healing part of it, but when Jamie talked about, you know, you see the content creators that, you know, say that they are reformed narcissists, for lack of a better phrase, I guess, is it kind of triggers me where I go, okay, but maybe you weren't that far up on the narcissistic scale. Because again, narcissists don't usually seek help. They don't usually see that they have a problem. And if somebody tries to point it out to them, what do? Is they flip the situation around. And we were talking about this beforehand, so that they never accept responsibility for how they've hurt other people, and they can't see the hurt for themselves. They can't empathize. So it's like, I have so many questions for those people that are creating content saying that they are recovered narcissists, or like going through the process to recover. And I take it with a grain of salt too, because it's a content creation world. So to be part of the narcissistic trend that's happening right now, I personally take it with a bit of grain of salt, but it's their entire being is just about, how do I control this? Controlling the narrative, controlling how I present, how people perceive me, because they cannot perceive me as less than. Otherwise, I feel intense amounts of shame. And that goes right back to childhood, from when their trauma originated. Because like you were talking about, Jamie, that's kind of where it begins, is something happened to them where they felt out of control, and this is the way that they learned how to gain control. Control looks different. Control looks different. I think that's a big thing too, is when I was going through this, I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know that I was in the abuse cycle because I didn't know that this was abuse, because it's so subtle. It's so just little things of how they control you.
I wrote down a couple topics, like a couple ideas that we want to touch on. And so, Sam, you're bringing up something that I want to make sure we hit on, which is, I title this, Narcissists Make You Feel Crazy. They absolutely make you feel like you are the problem. And again, I'm going to go back to my own personal experience. One of the things that just drove me the most, it drove me nuts. And I wanted to shake people, is I would tell my story, right? Because first of all, in my situation, it was a family member. So again, you don't like to go around bad mouthing family members. But there was times when it's like, I just need to tell somebody something because this is just getting too much. And you would tell your story, and then they would meet the person. And the person, in my case, I would talk to them about this family member. And 9 times out of 10, once they met this person, because this person had such a facade, they would come back to me and they're like, are you sure? Like, I didn't get that at all. Like, I talked to this person for an hour and they seemed completely normal to me. It automatically discounted all of my stories and everything that I was feeling, because this person was able to put on this facade and project normalcy to the outside world, when in fact they are anything but normal. And so I kind of put a name on that. I kind of put it on, I said their mask. And I said, well, you need to look behind their mask, because if their mask ever slipped, then you would see the real person. And I don't know if this is for all people that are narcissists or have this behavior. And Sam, I'm kind of interested to see if you can relate, but I actually found a way to trigger them to have their mask slip with this family member. Do I want to say it was my superpower? In this relationship, it was, because suddenly I had a way to make the people like around me see the same thing I was seeing. And what that trigger is I told this family member, no. I finally stood up and said, that's not what we're going to do. And I don't care if it was, hey, Malin, let's meet here for a family get together at this time. No. Hey, Malin, can you go into the fridge and get me a drink? No. Hey, I didn't care what it was, and it could be mundane, but it was enough that this person, it triggered them. And then their traits came out, their mask slipped, and people could see behind for the first time. And I remember there was one person in particular, other than Jamie, that I had told these stories to. And we were in a situation, and I said, no, we're not going to do that. And the mask slipped, and they saw the true reaction of this family member. And I remember after that, they came to me and they said, I had no idea that they would respond that way. So I just kind of want to tell that story, because to me, that's one of also another great tale of a narcissist, is that, and it's so aggravating that people just don't believe you at face value, because they meet these individuals and they seem salt of the earth. They seem above board. They seem normal, and they're anything but normal.
Yep. 100%. They seem so reasonable. They're so charming. They do volunteer work. They're upstanding citizens, all the things. And you are in that cycle of, is it me? Is it me? I found that in my own situation, sometimes I would share stories to just like I'm really angry about something. And so I just share the story. And as I'm telling it, I'm going, this doesn't seem as bad when I'm saying it out loud. So it seems so like, what the heck is your problem? But I'm so angry over it. And it's this thing and this thing and this thing. It's like this word. And that's where I'd start to really feel like I'm crazy, and other people would, I don't understand your problem. Like, what's the thing? But in the longer scope, then you could see, oh, this is the pattern over and over and over. And that's the subtle dig. And that's why I'm the only one reacting, versus the bigger things where when I tell the bigger stories and people will be like, oh my gosh, this is insane. Like, what the heck? This person's awful. And I'd gaslight myself and go, no. They couldn't possibly, this must have been an misunderstanding. Like, there's no way. They are so nice. I mean, look at them. They're so nice. They're so reasonable. How could this be? It's probably just me. It's that cycle of yeah, they have a mask and they teach you how to put their mask on in a way. Like you are protecting them by gaslighting yourself. I'm so happy that you were able to figure out how to make that mask slip. But it really is when you say no to them, like it is a switch. If they react in that moment, there could be, like in my situation, I sometimes wouldn't know for 6 months or years something that I did that triggered them, because they would do passive aggressive stuff like years later in some respects. They just like hold on to it as a method of control, by not reacting, but then using it to create whatever story they needed in their head of how they were like better than you or whatever. So this conversation.
I know Sam has told me a lot of stories about how this person that you're referring to has learned to not react and not respond to the triggers that you've recognized. And they've learned to not let the mask slip. So Malin, I'm curious if your family member was able to catch on and realize that no was a trigger and like catch themselves before the mask slipped.
Well, that's a very interesting question, Steph. And I'm going to kind of go back to a little bit of what Sam said, because I think it's multifaceted is my answer. Did I think sometimes they caught on? Yes. Did I think that there was more of an impulse response because how dare you tell me no? I think that impulse overdrove the common sense. Not all the time. All the time,
Right.
there were sometimes I would say no, and that would be the end of it. But there would be these things that would be, if there was other emotional things going on within the dynamic of the family. So if there was other family members that were acting up and then I was just another layer in there, it might have been enough for them to, that impulse comes out and they respond without thinking. There's some times when dealing with a narcissist, and Sam said this, that really kind of triggered for me. They have a memory that goes back years. Like I hold on to things, and then when I forgive them, I let them go. It's done. Dealing with a narcissist, they can say the words, they can make you even believe that they let that go. But at any moment where they need to pull that forward, just to make sure you know that they remember and how dare you do this. And if it's a way to kind of keep you down or suppressed in any situation, I don't care if we're talking about where do you guys want to go to dinner, and this person is like, I really don't want Thai food, and they're the only person that wants to go eat Italian, and yet we all need to start understanding we need to go eat Italian. Well, why? Why are your needs more important than the rest of us that are going to go to dinner with you? Well, you're kind of being selfish. And that doesn't surprise me, because 4 months ago, this situation happened and you were acting the same way. So you being selfish is just the person you are. So I understand that. So we'll go where you want to eat. Well, first of all,
then the defensive comes up.
Yeah.
And damn, if you try and do that to them later on, like remind them of what they did. Oh my gosh.
I have actual proof, written word from the person who I believe is a narcissist, that I have said these words back to them. I didn't say that. I have an email from you. No, you don't. Printed it out, gave it to him. Well, I don't remember sending this to you. Or my best one, you took this out of context. That's not what I mean.
Yeah.
That's not at all what I mean.
You're putting words in my mouth.
Yeah, it's like I said, this family member is made of Teflon, because no matter what you bring to them, no matter what you show them, what evidence you have them recorded doing something. No, you misunderstood what I said. The problem is always on my end with the person who I believe is a narcissist. It's always on my end. I was the one that misunderstood. I was the one that caused the problem. I was the one who wouldn't let something go. I'm the one that attacked them, and they just responded because I was attacking them. Never once have I ever been in a conversation for 25 years with this person, this family member, have they ever openly and honestly told me, I'm sorry, I was wrong. What I did was horrible. Not one time.
It's that repeated pattern that I think you have to watch for, because it is hard sometimes to take ownership for something you did wrong, right? And so, and I think that's part of the perpetuation of this as a topic, is that, there's things like that you can pluck out of any relationship, any friendship, any, kind of thing. It's that repeated over time thing that really starts to help you see, okay, maybe this isn't what it appears to be. This isn't just, one situation. This isn't just a thing. Is it possible that it's just a bad match? You know what I mean? If you're in a relationship where this has become the pattern and the problem, is it possible that it's just a bad match? Because I can even look back in a relationship close to me and say, wow. I mean, there was some addiction involved. And so I think that kind of shifted things a little bit too. Like I can look back and see that that was the dynamic between the two of us, but that wasn't, I don't know that I believe that he was a narcissist. You know what I mean? That was just the dynamic between the two of us. It was not a good match. You know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying, Jamie. And I think that is in my opinion, that is a very stark difference between being in a relationship with someone who I'm going to air quote is a normal individual. Because again, I agree with what Sam was saying earlier. I think everybody has these traits. I think it's individuals that have them off the charts that really make it really hard. And one of the things I'm going to say, Sam, I'm kind of looking to you to see if you can relate at all. When you're in an argument with a person, and this is, again, my opinion, when you're in an argument with these individuals that are narcissists, you're not fighting an argument based on the here and now. You're fighting an argument that spans from the beginning of your relationship with them. And I think that to me is a real big difference, because when you have a normal fight, like Jamie, when you and I fight, it's here and now. We resolve it, it's done, right? We have gone back and brought some stuff up, but very, very, not very often, right? Like once it's kind of forgiven, you're kind of like, okay, whatever.
Right.
This individual, this narcissist, reach back. If I had an argument with them today, they would talk about things that happened the first moment I met them 25 years ago, as if it just happened yesterday. To me, that's a real big difference between a person who is a narcissist versus just what I'll say normal person, is because it's hard to fight an argument that spans 25 years. Because to a normal person, who holds on to those minute details for that length of time? But in my opinion, and in my lived experience with this person, they can recall things 25 years ago like they just happened this morning. And how do you fight against that when there's that much coming at you, that much history, that much anger? Because I will say, with my family member, there's a lot of anger. The sweet words come out of their mouth. Oh, we love you. Oh, welcome to the family. Oh, we adore you. Behind my back, he's lazy. He took my family away. He's a nuisance. His family is very selfish. He's a selfish person. But yet when you talk to this person up front, I mean, honey would not have dripped out of their mouth anymore, as if it was just mind-boggling. So to me, and Sam, I'm going to pause here to kind of let you jump in to see if you have any similarities. To me, that's a big driving force, is that I'm not fighting with this individual about something that happened right now. I'm fighting with them for a 25 history of things that have happened in the course of our relationship. And that's tough.
Yeah, it's really tough. I don't think that, like, in terms of a bad match, if you are with a narcissist, it is a bad match. Usually because they are with somebody that's very empathetic, because that feeds them. They need feeling because they don't feel. So they go with the people that are willing to please and willing to, listen to their stories of how they were so traumatized as a child, or how, they're with somebody that's like willing to take the blame because they want to fix whatever's happened. So you have an argument, and when they flip it back around on you, when you're like, hey, this happened, I was really hurt by it, can we talk about it? And then they flip it and go, I never said that. I would never say that to you. Like, that's awful that you would think of me that way. I would never say that about you. And then you end up apologizing for something that they actually hurt you with. A normal relationship wouldn't do that. And it wouldn't do that over and over and over and over and over again. You are actually going to have conversations where there's some form of resolution and there's some form of compatibility, versus all of these things lining up of what the cycle of abuse is with narcissists. So to say that a relationship that wasn't a good fit does have some traits of narcissism, like, yeah, it will, because people, when we feel hurt, we do things that we're trying to control. We're trying to control and manipulate and whatnot. So we do act mean, but it really goes deeper. It goes deeper than that. And I've heard this said before, and I definitely agree, is you don't understand what narcissistic abuse is like unless you've been in it. because it is so deep-seated and it is so subtle. And it's almost like a lobster being put in a pot of cold water with the temperature slowly warming up. You don't realize what it is until it's too late and you're trapped in it. And like at my therapist's office, she's got an article there and I took pictures of it, and it's how to explain narcissistic abuse when somebody doesn't believe you. And I just sent that out to a bunch of people because it was really good. In my situation, I don't feel as though I had information from the past constantly being dragged up versus resentment from the past for things that I had no idea even happened. But that would be I always said it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I didn't know what the straw was or where the rest of the hay came from. I had no idea. It was just this pile that grew and grew and grew because conversations never happened. And if they did happen, it would be flipped around. And so I always felt like you're walking on eggshells. You don't know how to behave around this person. You don't know what you can talk about in what situation. Are they available for you to have this conversation? What's going to come up? If you do bring it up, what are they going to attack you with later on? Like you don't know if you're getting Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde.
Well, and another thing that when you were talking, Sam, it kind of triggered my mind. No other time in my life have I ever experienced this with any of the other people that I have relationships with. My narcissistic family member rewrote their history. I've never experienced that before. So things that happened to them or things that they did when they were younger, and we're talking maybe teenage, young adult in their 20s and 30s, they will rewrite the narrative to tell people that's not how it went down. This is how it went down. And with my family member, you talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When somebody rewrites their past and everything you knew about this person for 10 years has now shifted because they have deemed to just make themselves look even better by making them the victim. And I don't say this casually, right? Like victim mentality is something that we're talking about. Like I don't just throw this out there to say they were playing the victim. This is truly something that to me is the only saving grace I have to my family member is I do believe that this is a mental condition of some type, because when somebody can look at family members and people that have known them for 10 years at this point of the situation I'm thinking about, it was 10 years that I know this person. So this was a decade, right? There was family members around that knew this person even longer and without hesitation started rewriting their history. This major event that took place that based off of their actions had consequences. Suddenly it wasn't because they were a willing participant, is because somebody did it to them. It took all of the responsibility and blame off of this family member. And this was just one of many times where they literally rewrote their history. And so how do you have a relationship with someone where who you think they are is not the same because they keep trying to make it so that facade, that mask gets better and better and better, and they become more salt of the earth, nothing they do is wrong. And yet when people hear some of the situations that go on, they just can't believe it. To me, that's another telltale sign is that this person's history keeps changing over the course of the 25 years that I've known this person. It's happened 2 or 3 times that they've rewrote their own past.
And they will often, especially if you're meeting them for the first time, they will often tell a story talking about what they did, but describing it as though it happened to them. So they will project their actions on someone else and saying that that's what happened to them. So then you think, oh my gosh, that's so awful. Like, absolutely. So then the person that they did those actions to, they now become the bully to this new person that is meeting them. And then the narcissist, aka the victim, gets all the empathy. And so that starts that trauma bond cycle, which is absolutely part like that abuse cycle. But that's how they get you, is they totally rewrite their history. I love how you described it like that. I I love how you describe it like that. And then if you call them on it because you have the receipts, you understand what happened, or, maybe they told you something at the beginning of the relationship with you or somewhere along the way. And then you brought it up and it was just, just like a fact of life type of thing. And then you reference it later on and they're like, no, that never happened to me. That never happened to me. What are you talking about? Or they will actually say something happened to you to try and get you to think that that happened to you. And therefore that's why you do X, Y, Z, or, whatever. So they actually try and implant thoughts into your head where they rewrite your history. I don't know if that ever happened to you, but it certainly happened to me on numerous occasions. And if you try and fight it, they realize they're like, okay, they're not ready for this yet. They're not ready. And then so they wait and they try again, months, years later to try and implant the same story.
Yeah, I think I saw this with this family member because they would say things like, well, you don't understand because this is how you were raised. And I would always tell them, you don't get to tell me how I was raised. And they would try another tactic. Well, your parents are really great, but the way they raised you wasn't right. Or these are the mistakes that they did for you. As the relationship kept going more and more, I started recognizing those things where they were almost putting down my way my parents were bringing me up, or the way that I grew up, or some of the beliefs that I held dear. They would start trying to chip away at them. And to your point, Sam, is when I fought back and I was like, no, don't go here, or I even pushed back really hard, they would find all other ways of trying to kind of, I kind of like how you phrase it because I never thought about that, but kind of implanting, I'm going to say they were implanting doubts of my past in my mind. And I don't think I really sat and thought about it in that term until you just said that, but that's exactly what they were doing. But I took great offense to that because, you're talking about my family and my parents in particular. You better tread carefully. And this person tried several different ways to make me start doubting the way that I was raised, which I think is kind of what you're leading to. Like, had that gone unchecked, I think that could very easily become them telling me and putting in some of those, false memories or things into my head where I would start believing them. I could see that happening very quickly.
Yeah, this conversation is actually a great example of isolation. That is, so if you look at the different ways narcissistic abuse happens, like when I was first learning about narcissism because of, whatever reels and TikToks and all that kind of stuff on there, be like, that doesn't happen. That does no, that's not me. Even though people were telling me like, this is the situation. That is a great example of subtle isolation. So they try and isolate you so that they become your authority figure. That's who you go to in order to have your reality confirmed. That's who you go to for advice, whatever it is, so that they become your person that tells you what's right or wrong. That's how they control you. So that little bit of implantation or changing stories, whatever it is, that is a form of isolation. When you think isolation, you think, like they've got you in a hole, in a basement type of thing. Like that's we go to the extremes of what does isolation look like? This is what isolation looks like in narcissistic abuse. It reframes who you go to. It is subtle stuff like your friend, she doesn't treat you very nicely. This thing that happened, that's not a really good thing. Are you sure you really want to talk to them? Are you sure you really want to hang out with them? Like, they're not really good for you. Those types of things is what starts to, you self-isolate, essentially, because of the thoughts that they've implanted in your head in order to second guess your reality. And so you end up doing it to yourself. And then they can turn around and say, well, I never wanted you to, stop talking to your friend or stop talking to your family. Why would I ever do that? That's ridiculous. Why would I ever say that your parents were a bad influence for you? That's ridiculous. I would never do that. It's all part of it. So if anybody's listening and you start to see these behaviors, start to see these comments, just start paying attention. Just start paying attention and seeing what happens. I hope there's a seed planted in that.
Yeah, there's subtlety is kind of the key word that I'm picking up from that, because it doesn't happen with a sledgehammer, right? It comes in and it's a million little things that add up to a big thing. It's never them going to come to you and say, you need to stop listening to your parents now, or you need to stop listening to these individuals. We're now your authority. It's all those little doubts. So subtlety to me is kind of the key. Like that is probably, it's a course over a million little things and not any one big thing. But then when you collect all the little million things together, it is a pretty big rock you have to overcome. I kind of want to get into, first of all, if Steph or Jamie, either one of you guys have questions, because I feel like I've just been jumping in when Sam's done talking. But I do kind of want to talk about, for me at least, when I finally started pushing back on the narcissistic behavior, because up to a point I was almost making excuses for this individual, and then I was starting to change the way I even interacted with this individual to avoid the difficult conversations or the hard conversations. And I found myself almost doing things to appease this person, because it was a lot easier than having to deal with all of the ripple effects of having a relationship with this individual when it didn't go the way they wanted to. And when I finally got to the point where I was like, enough's enough, and I started fighting back, that's really when I'll say the crap hit the fan. And, I talked about earlier about triggering this family member. When I was fighting back, anytime I said no, that's when the mask would come off, because I was already sending out shockwaves in their world, because I wasn't playing the game anymore. And when I stopped doing that, that's when things got ugly. So I don't know, before we go there, I'll get, I guess, Jamie, Steph, Sam, any questions or anything about anything else we've talked about that we want to go back to?
I have a question for Jamie, actually, because as Malin's sharing his story, like, you obviously know his background, being friends for 30 years, and I've known Steph for a couple of years now. So as Malin's talking, I'm hearing so many overlaps and like things that I've heard Steph say, like from her own story, based on what Malin's saying. Like, I'm seeing so many themes and patterns and stuff. So I'm curious if you've noticed that when Sam talks, like any of the overlaps.
Well, thankfully, I have limited interaction with Malin's family member. I do remember, though, I was shocked too, because I was dazzled and amazed by this person when I first met them. And I remember like those first stories, like, nah, that is not even possible. Do you remember that, Malin? I had a hard time believing it too.
To me, that was a sign, because Jamie was my closest, oldest friend. And Jamie, this is no shade to you, I think we've talked about this in the past, but if I couldn't convince my friend of, at the time it was probably 15 years, 20 years at that point, who knows? But if I couldn't convince my friend that this was happening, who else would believe me, right? Like, I remember having those thoughts in my mind. So no, I remember that, Jamie.
Yeah. I was just dazzled. They're an amazing human being. And it took a long time, I think. It's been such a long journey with this one that it's, eventually it just wasn't a surprise. And I was just sad by all of the things that they were experiencing, that Malin and his family were experiencing because of this person. And, I can see. It's funny because I remember it was just a few years ago, Malin had been like, hey, we found this article and I think this is what's happening. And then it was like all the pieces kind of clicked together for me as far as like the severity of what they were experiencing. I'm like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that sooner? Because I kind of live in that mental health world and I feel like I should have. I mean, I knew there was something wrong, right? Like, I think I remember having some conversations with Malin a long time ago being like, no, there's something wrong with that person. Like, there's something, that person needs some help, right? And so, but then, after that, it was like, no, look at all the signs. It's all there. And so, I feel like I am always going to fall on the side of, there's hope for everyone, like recovery is possible, that we can grow and change as human beings, we can be reflective, and we can, something can happen to shift that. I do recognize that this specific issue for people is really difficult. And, I hold out hope for change, and also I think the important thing for me with Malin has just been to sit in it with him and just listen and be there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I will say for anybody else who's listening, if you have a really good friend or family member or somebody that you can confide in, I don't know if this is good advice or not, but this is my advice. Invite that person into your world and have them be part of the inner circle with you. Because I fought this, other than the other family members that were suffering. I mean, we were all suffering. And Sam, I think you said this, the narcissists in my family dynamic did everything they can to narrow the circle of people. So you get that sense of isolation. So suddenly the only people you're talking to are the same people who are being in this abusive relationship. And by then, who are you really helping? You're just telling somebody else who's also being abused by this person. So for me, Jamie was that one lifeline that was outside of that circle of influence and outside of that family dynamic. And I remember when I started sharing some really specific details and sending some emails and text messages. And I think that's when it also, like Jamie, not to speak for you, like you're not in the room, but when Jamie would respond to that, like, that's terrible. That's horrible. I can't believe they said this. That's when I was starting to be like, okay, someone is seeing what I'm seeing, and they're starting to hear the story. They're starting to see the story. And, over a period of time, and we're talking a period of years, you get enough of these text messages, enough of these emails, and suddenly, as Jamie had stated, she's not surprised by things anymore. But it took almost providing that evidence to say, this is what I'm going through. This is not normal. And this is why I'm fighting so hard. But for anybody who's listening, if you have someone or you don't have someone, find someone who's outside of that influence of that narcissist, because it was a lifeline. And was very useful.
Well, and I think too, Sam kind of spoke to that isolation piece. I think that's huge because whenever you're in a heavily abusive situation, that is the number one tactic to get you away from those outside sources who can tell you this isn't right. This isn't healthy. This isn't normal in air quotes or whatever, When you can disconnect someone from all of their outside supports, then there is no sounding board. There's no mirror. There's no way to say, are you sure that's okay for you? Because that's not what I know for you. I don't know that's, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's not somebody who's like, you said you'd never be treated like that, and now you're being treated like that. It's just important to have those outside connections. And I think that probably is different depending upon the position of the person who's displaying these narcissistic features in your life. The closer you are, the harder it is to be able to have those connections outside of that relationship. When it's a little removed, it's easy for me to go to Thanksgiving and sit around a Thanksgiving table with a person with the narcissistic characteristics because I know I get to leave Crazy Town and go home to normalcy. But when you live in Crazy Town all the time, it's hard to realize that that's what's happening because that becomes reality for you. So, I think, and quite frankly, I think that's probably why this is such a hot topic right now, because I think because these kind of outlets and these kind of creators that are creating this content, it's hitting people who probably are isolated. And it's like a light bulb for them to say, oh gosh, wait, this is something that's happening for me. And they've never seen it before. They've never heard it before. So I can't say that I feel like it's a bad thing that it's like all over social media. The bad thing can be the, armchair psychologists that are diagnosing everyone they know with whatever OCD and PTSD and every other thing. But I would say that that's probably true in a lot of abusive situations, is that you need to have those outside connections to help you connect to yourself, to help you remember what is okay for you and what's not okay for you.
Yeah. Especially because the longer you're in the abuse, the more, number one, you fight to keep their mask on, because you're gaslighting yourself of, is this actually real? When you try and talk about it, you feel as though you sound crazy. You have the question of, am I going to be believed? Who's going to believe me? They look so like put together. They're so charming. They've convinced you that no one's going to believe you and that you shouldn't even believe you. They really, really have you second guessing yourself so that you don't seek outside help. And in the meantime, they've taken everybody away from you, or they've had you take everybody away from yourself. And then, like, for my own personal experience, it was through social media that I learned more about what it looked like. So people weren't always saying, narcissists, but they were giving the examples. They were sharing examples. They were sharing words, phrases, situations. Because it's so subtle, because it's on a spectrum, you don't know what it looks like. So like we talked about the isolation, you can go and read online and you're like, oh, gaslighting, manipulation, control, blah, 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 changing narratives, but you don't know what that actually looks like in real life. And when it happens to you, it is so subtle and it just gets your defensive mode up. And the longer you've been in it, like the more you have the internal dialogue of, do I actually engage in this? Do I hold back? Oh, what's their mood today? Do I, you're walking on eggshells. And from my personal experience, I had people in my life saying, hey, this is the situation. And it took a year for me to finally continue to see things on social media and continue to have people like saying this to me for me to go, maybe this is. And I had somebody that I let into my world to try and help me make sense of something else in my life, that they then got to sort of see this dynamic. It took them almost 10 months of seeing what I was dealing with for them to finally go, maybe they aren't super reasonable, because now I see something that seems to be a pattern. But in the meanwhile, they were supporting me while also supporting this other person and like trying to sort of knit us together in a way, not like actually knit us together. They weren't in communication with this other person, but they didn't see it. It took almost 10 months for this person that I let into my close circle for them to finally see it when they were receiving what I was receiving. And that's a long time to be in that.
Well, and I was going to say that is, I think one thing that I can see a positive outcome of all of the attention is those patterns of healthy relationships. It can be on any of that degree. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, I can think of my own very unhealthy relationship. I protected that person from my family, from my friends. I put on a positive persona and I rationalized lots of things to the point that when I finally did leave, it was like, my close family and some of my friends were like, what is wrong with you? Why would you, like I was the bad guy. I was the bad person because I left. And it was because of my own doing, because I had protected that person and I had made excuses and put out a different picture of what was really happening behind the scenes, And like I said, I don't think that person is a narcissist. I think there were lots of other issues, but I don't think narcissism was one of them. But that is a telltale sign in an unhealthy relationship. And I think anything comes of this episode, even just to be aware of what's happening in your relationship and those unhealthy things, and label it or don't. But if it's not healthy and it's not good for you, what are you going to do to fix that? Is it, is it irreparable, or is it something that you can work on together? And that takes somebody who's willing to do that. And that's probably a big difference in that spectrum, right? of that issue.
So a question that keeps coming up, sorry, you want to go?
No, you go ahead, Steph. Go ahead.
So a question that I keep having, like, as we're going through this conversation is, it sounds like there's almost like a checklist of things that make somebody a narcissist. Like they isolate, they control, they're manipulative, they gaslight, etc. But I'm almost wondering if people on social media or just in general, like the reason that the word narcissist has become such a buzzword is because somebody in their life will exhibit one of those characteristics. And then everybody just boxes them in. Like narcissist is like the word that now comes to mind for people to describe any one of these behaviors. But I think it sounds like in order to be a narcissist, you're going to have at least, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 of these characteristics. And that's what makes you a narcissist, not just the trait of being manipulative or an isolationist, because those things can all happen with different types of abusive relationships. But just because somebody exhibits one of those doesn't mean they are a narcissist.
Yeah, I think that when people, before narcissism became sort of like this online trend, when you think of narcissistic, you think of someone with a big ego, they're the loud person in the room. They're always talking about themselves and flashing whatever they've got going on. That's the type of narcissist people think about. So then when they're in a relationship and, they break up or whatever, they think of, oh, this person was so selfish. They were, they had such a big ego. They always talked about themselves, or they were really mean to me. I cried one day and they just told me to suck it up. I feel like it's more that conversation that some people end up using narcissists, the label on. But in the same respect, because narcissists are not, it's like 1% of the population actually gets diagnosed, something crazy like that, because they don't seek therapy. And when they're brought to therapy by somebody else, number one, most therapists are not trained in that type of abuse, and so they don't see it. And number two, they will present their own mask and they will use therapy to their own advantage to continue to abuse. So people are now seeing examples of narcissism, like actual narcissistic abuse, what it looks like. Screw the label. Like people are actually sharing, here is an example. Like we talked about the isolation. Here is an example. This is emotional abuse. This is psychological abuse. This is narcissism. Get help type of thing. I think that's why more and more people are kind of seeing it and talking about it also, because there's that flip side of people that have been in it that weren't aware that they were in it. And now they're starting to go, hang on a second, am I in it? And then, hopefully that puts them down a path of seeing the patterns. But, you mentioned, Steph, about a checklist for narcissism. I think more importantly, let's not talk about the abuser, but let's talk about the victim. What are they experiencing? What is their checklist? Do you feel like you have to walk on eggshells? Do you feel like you have Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde? Do you feel like, there's some sort of communication issue, but you just can't put your finger on it? Do you feel like your voice isn't being heard? Do you feel like, what is that list? For me, I had someone that said, like, forget narcissism, forget that. And I was going down the path and like looking at this stuff and being like, no, it's not that, because what's out there is like extreme and not going into the subtleties. But it was a list. It was like 21 signs of emotional abuse. And I read that and went, holy freaking shit, this is my life. Like, whoa. And so it's more that is look up emotional psychological abuse. If you check those boxes, chances are pretty darn good that you have somebody that's not just a bad person in a relationship. Like that's really, really unhealthy. And then you need to a psychologist that's actually trained in this type of abuse and then get actual help. And it can take years for you to finally realize it. And when you're in it for so long, and I don't know if this is the case for you, but when you're in it for so long, you don't realize that this type of abuse actually gives you PTSD.
So I actually want to build on that, Sam, because I have, which I think is, I don't think I'm unique that this is the first time this has happened, but in my circle, family, friends, this is a very unique situation. And, for a long time, I struggled before it became mainstream and before we, everything we've talked about it being out there and everybody's a narcissist because you have one of these 300 traits, whatever they are. I remember thinking to myself, why aren't people talking about this more? Why I can't be the only person, right? Like my family can't be the only one that has this problem. And through, looking and researching and having these types of conversations, I've done some reflection. And one of the things that I've noticed is in my family dynamic, this person has had influence over family members for generations, plural, multi-generations. And who I feel the most sorry for in a narcissistic relationship are children. And the reason is because they are the most malleable. They are the most forgiving, and they are the ones that if you grow up in this environment, they don't know any different. And so when I looked across this family member in these relationships, the relationships that began with this family member when they were children versus if they were as an adult or even a teenager that would start having an interaction with them. The kids that grew up in it didn't even recognize that there was a problem, because having Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde show up for Thanksgiving dinner is Thanksgiving. Having you constantly second guessing yourself or not second guessing this person is just how life is lived. So now you have a whole generation of these people growing up, at least in my family, and I have to say across, the world, where it's no longer even, I have a checklist that I can say this is a narcissist, or even to your point, which I think is a great point, to say, have I been part of an emotional, abusive relationship? These individuals that grow up from the time of childhood, I firmly believe, would not even recognize that they have things that are showing up on that list. And so it breaks my heart for children who've had to grow up with either a parent as a narcissist, grandparent, uncle, whoever this family member is, because if they've lived in it from the time they were born or a young child, they may not even have the ability to recognize that there's problems, because that's just how life is lived. And I've seen that firsthand in my family. And so I just kind of want to bring that point forward, is that this is why it's very hard to diagnose narcissism. This is why it's very hard to get out of that relationship. Or even for the longest time, I tried to change the narcissist. Like, this is not the relationship I want with you. Let's change the relationship to have a healthier relationship. They're not in the market for health. They're in the market for control. So even if it's an unhealthy relationship, as long as they remain in control, they don't care. And so I just kind of wanted to put that out there, because, again, we're talking about these lists and these relationships, and, try to boil it down to black and white. And it's so easy to diagnose. It's so easy to kind of understand what the symptoms and signs look like. But truly, I have family members in my family who, because they have grown up in it and they know no different, they would never ring that bell as if I've been in an abusive relationship or this person is a narcissist. And when you're fighting against that, it's a very steep uphill battle, very steep.
Yeah, when you're fighting against kids of narcissists. Yeah, because that's all they know. And even if they had a healthy parent with a narcissist and a healthy parent, like being an involved parent, so they had some form of juxtaposition, it's hard to even say that they would recognize the difference. Really, like, they recognize the difference between the two parents, but in terms of your point of really being able to say that was an unhealthy relationship, I agree that I don't think that they would necessarily be able to say that, because that's just the way it is. And to turn on your own parent when biologically you are ingrained that that is your protector, however they show up for you. And with a narcissist, you don't cross them. So if you are a child trying to, speak your mind as a child, that doesn't happen. You learn coping mechanisms. You may become a narcissist yourself. But as an adult too, it just is an ingrained pattern in you of, like, you don't cross them. So I'm definitely more on the agreeing with you of a child-parent relationship, that a child would not actually be able to determine that that was an abusive relationship.
Well, and you also have kids that are going to see that dynamic and then repeat that dynamic. So then you have, it does perpetuate maladaptive relationship patterns, I think, for kids who have grown up in that. It makes it really difficult. I think you've got kids that are people pleasers and have to do everything, codependent or whatever other term you might want to put on that, just make sure everybody's okay and do all the things that you need to do to keep the peace in every situation. Or you have kids that grow up and might repeat those abusive cycles because that's how they learned and that's what they saw. And that is super sad, because that makes kids victims in this too.
Absolutely, it does. And I'm kind of looking at the clock, and there's I want to get into some of the tactics that I found that my narcissist has done, and then plus kind of what happened when we started fighting back. But I don't know if we have the time to get into all of that. I just think it's really helpful to have these types of conversations, and I hope our listeners, you hear this, and if it doesn't apply to you, just make sure you keep an eye out for maybe a friend or a family member that's going through this, and help be that support for somebody. I think that's the best that we can hope for. But I can't even say thank you enough, because it's been years that I've been dealing with this, and I don't mind sharing. We've had to, after years, it finally got to the point where we had to sever all ties and communications to this family member. Like, they have been surgically removed from our lives. And, the stupid thing is we are trying to do things even now in this conversation. I haven't named names. I haven't been too specific. And it's all because there's still that hope that maybe this family member can come back into our lives. But the reality is, this isn't the first time we've tried this approach. And this isn't the first time that this family member, it's almost like they can't help themselves. They just go back to their old tricks. And so sadly, I don't see any time in the near future where we're actually going to allow this person back into our lives. But it was truly, once we surgically removed them, distance and having them removed from our life, it was almost the event that finally highlighted all these areas that were the problem. Because suddenly, when you had holidays without this person, we're not at each other's throat and there's not a big drama session over the stupidest things. You mean you can get along with everybody? I mean, it's the subtle things. We go back to that term, the subtle things. But I can't even express how much just this conversation helps make me feel kind of normal. Because
normal. I was just going to say normal.
Yeah, that is a feeling that you don't normally have when you're dealing with someone who is a narcissist. It is designed that way, I believe, by the narcissist. You feel like you are the problem. You feel like you are the odd man out. You are the one that is the only one that's seeing this. So therefore, the trouble must reside within you. And just having this conversation helps with that.
I wholeheartedly agree. It varies so much peace when you no longer have the chaos, and the subtleties create the chaos, which destabilizes you and puts them in control. It is classic narcissism. So I'm glad to hear that you surgically removed that and have found that peace. But I agree. It goes back to the point that I made earlier of hearing somebody say, unless you've experienced it, unless you've experienced the abuse, it's very difficult to understand truly. Like, we've been able to have this conversation, and we're even having a deeper layer conversation than I think Steph and Jamie really recognize, because we understand when we're talking about, these specific examples or traits or whatnot, we understand the full scope just by words that the other is using, of like, oh no, you get it. Whereas I don't think Steph and Jamie, and I mean, I don't want to speak for you guys, but there's a different layer there. So if anybody is listening to this and someone comes to you and says like, hey, I want to run something past you, and you don't think it's a big deal, I want you to just slow down and listen to them, and don't just automatically dismiss them. They probably can't build the patterns by themselves, but you starting to listen and make note of what's happening, their nervous system has a hard time doing that. So you can be a rock for them and just listen. You don't have to believe them or disbelieve them. Just be there for them, and don't just automatically discount, because as we've said, these types of people are incredibly smooth, incredibly charming, incredibly Teflon. And Teflon is toxic, all right? Teflon is toxic.
Well, and I guess, I do think sometimes these kind of situations lend themselves to what can easily be classified as like domestic abuse or domestic violence. And if you do find yourself in that situation, I just want to put out there that there is a national domestic violence hotline available to you that you can get help at. They can listen, they can give you some guidance and advice. And you can reach out to them, 800-799-7233, or you can text BEGIN to 88788. And there is someone there available to chat with you via text, or you can talk with someone on the phone, and they can kind of walk you through it too. If you feel like you're in a situation where your boundaries are not respected and it's hard to maintain those boundaries, that might be an outlet too. So I just want to offer that as a resource available to our listeners.
Thanks, Jamie. And one thing, and again, I know we've talked about, it's not one size fits all, and it's not, so trying to figure out the narcissist as it is trying to say, are you in an abusive relationship? But in our show notes, we're going to go ahead and have this link here. I did find an article that just says signs of narcissistic abuse. Again, I can't self-diagnose. We don't want to do that for you. But if this is a way that if any of these sound familiar, maybe call that number that Jamie has kind of given. And so just quickly, some of the signs have to do with love bombing, gaslighting, disrespecting boundaries, which I think we've talked about that a couple different times, emotional blackmail. This person will use insults. They might actually sabotage the relationship, make accusations. They could actually have physical abuse. That could be a sign. They could do a smear campaign, and they can do what's called withholding, basically destroying your self-esteem. Do a lot of criticizing about you or what you do. So if this person, and again, the link will be in the show notes. So if you want to go take a look at it, it will be there for you. But if you have somebody in your life that's, showing signs of any of these, maybe have that to kind of be your first step to recognize that that's happening. And then where you go from there probably will be baby steps, but know that there's people out there, there's resources available, and we just wish you the best, I guess. So I just wanted to kind of throw those signs out there because I thought, if anything, if someone's listening and any of those ring a bell, hopefully that's the first step for them.
Yeah, I just want to add something too, if I can, is that list. You may be hearing that list going like, absolutely not, what does that even mean? Like, I didn't know what a boundary was, so to say, oh, they push your boundaries is like, I don't know what that means. Going back to our isolation point, it can be that small. So even just if you just feel something's off, write it down. Write down what happened. Write down how you felt. Write down what they said. Write down what you said. And the next time something happens, do it again. Just write it down, because over time, you'll be able to see whether or not this is a pattern of abuse or it's just an actual normal person where you can go back and say like, hey, this happened to me, or, I felt this way when this happened. Let's talk about it. If you do that with a person that's on the spectrum, you're gonna start seeing, I then had to apologize for them when I brought up something that they did kind of thing. So just write it down, and it will help you feel not crazy or not as crazy versus just going and telling it to a friend. You may forget specific instances, but I just wanted to put that out there, is write it down and absolutely call domestic violence numbers, and they can get you in touch with further resources. Even if you don't think, just call.
Yeah. No, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Well, I just want to thank you both for joining us today for this episode. It's been enlightening. It's been hopefully healing for some and informational, but I'd love to give you a chance to plug your podcast. Tell us all about what you're doing and where we can find you.
Sam, do you wanna do it? Or you want me to?
You go ahead. I've talked a lot.
Okay. So you can find us on the Becoming Human AF podcast. We dive into all different kinds of topics about, basically humanity. What does it mean to be human? What makes us human? What makes us tick? We'll talk a little bit about politics. That was a little bit scary recently. But we also talk about things like what is the difference between beliefs, values, and opinions. So it's a whole spectrum of just what it means to be human, and our whole journey through Becoming Human AF. So yeah, you can find us on all the platforms, all the socials. Yeah.
Awesome. When do your new episodes drop?
We're kind of working that out. So right now we're kind of in a weird, we'll say Thursdays, but we're not sure when we're going to come back.
No, we're on holidays.
I understand.
Yeah, we're on holiday. Exactly.
Behind the scenes, Jamie and I are on the holidays too, and we've just put our recording schedule out. So our listeners, they think we're still on a cadence. We're not.
Okay.
Well, and
podcasters, BTS.
Yeah, not even sure when this episode is dropping, but now we know it's the holidays, right?
Right. Yeah, we're kind of in the middle of like figuring out what direction we're going to go in next. But sometime in 2025, it's not really helpful, but yeah.
But go check out the past episodes. We've had some really awesome conversations, and truly it is all about how to have hard conversations, and a lot of them being with yourself. Mm-hmm. And doing that inner work, that growth work, so that you can become a better human and just understand that you are human AF, just like the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
I love that. And actually that ties in so nicely, even with the season that we're kind of on the downward slide. So appreciate you guys coming on. I hope we could do this again. It was a lot of fun. Maybe we can pick a lighter topic to discuss rather than just jumping into the whole narcissism. It's a light conversation on a Sunday afternoon. Not at all. But, do appreciate you guys coming on and sharing your stories and just having an honest conversation. Not a lot of people want to kind of dive into this type of topic. And so very much appreciated.
Yeah, well, our next conversation will be easier.
It was a good conversation, though. I really liked it.
Well, we'll go ahead and get everything wrapped up here. If you guys can just hold on for just a few minutes and then we'll come back on to you once we're done. So again, thank you very much for having the conversation. We appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you all for joining us for this episode of Roundtable Mindset. We'll be back again in a couple weeks. Make sure you drop in and see what we have to discuss next time. We'll see you all later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.